The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival of the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And then, as promised, the gospel reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. You can find it in the New Testament portion on page 20. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the 2 of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you asked, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So in case you haven't already figured this out about me, I like stories. I like biblical characters and personas and structure. I like beginnings and middles and ends. I like plots and I like plot twists. And I love a good paradox. So when I read this morning's lectionary readings, I have to tell you I was a bit disappointed. They just seem so mundane. Mundane. Of relating to or characteristic of the world, characterized by the practical, transitory, and ordinary. Commonplace. The mundane concerns of day-to-day life. In Exodus, we have instructions on how the Hebrews should participate in the Passover. It's full of mundane details about the kind of lamb we should obtain and how to kill it, how the meat should be cooked, and how much of it one should eat, and what to do with the leftovers, and where to place the blood on the doorposts. These instructions will serve as a pattern for the Hebrew people, one that will shape their lives from the time even before this was written down up until the present. But that's not all this passage has to say. It also tells us how the Hebrew people will be saved on the night that God passes over the land of Egypt, and that God will strike down every firstborn among the Egyptians, be they animal or human, it doesn't matter, on account of the actions of their leader, the Pharaoh. And the words in Exodus have been used throughout church history and are even being used now to elevate the importance, the chosenness of some over others, while giving others reason to hold others in oppression, to kill them even. In Romans, Paul tells the community that they should owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. And this is all well and good and sounds very Christ-like. But this passage also falls in the middle of Romans, where Paul urges followers not to resist authority, and that they should be subject to the governing authorities of their time. Paul certainly thinks that Christ makes claims on one's life and that you should be faithful to the claims that Christ has made, but he also thinks that that can be done within the existing structure of government that one is subject to, no matter if one actually buys into that structure or not. And in this passage, Paul repeats some of the mundane details about how the community should and should not behave, rules that they've heard many times before, but Paul's kind of big on do's and don'ts. The problem is that this letter to the Romans has been exploited and manipulated throughout history in order to hold people in their place, encouraging them not to rebel and or escape abusive and unjust relationships. And not just on a personal level either, but on a communal level, on national levels, and even on international levels, all in the name of love, of course, for the good of all. And then there's our gospel reading, where Jesus instructs the community, which is specifically called the church in this passage, on the rules of discipline and mutual correction. This passage is pretty mundane in every sense of the word. Even the heading in my Bible says, "Disciplining members of the church." Yawn. But I do kind of like this passage, if for no other reason than that it seems to acknowledge that the church is not some holy, unblemished, pristine community without problems and disagreements and conflicts. Jesus seems to openly admit that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there will be conflict. And when conflict happens, this is how you should deal with it. My issue, though, is that this passage has unfortunately also been used throughout church history to isolate, judge, and ostracize all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons, in effect, kicking them out of the church, perhaps at times when they most needed a faith community. A community to stick up for them, to accept them, to include them and defend them, and not only to recognize, but to point to their worth and their unique contributions to the family of God as children of God. So this week's readings puzzles me. They have kept me awake many nights this week. and I've been wrestling with these seemingly mundane matters. In one of my late nights, I came across an article by Luke Timothy Johnson, a New Testament scholar with an interest in early church history at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. The article was written way back in 1990, and in it he writes that he wonders what it might mean to be charged as a community of Christ followers to live by the Word when the Word is flung at us in fragments. And not only is it flung at us in fragments, but it's also with fragmented interpretations. These passages remind us of how different people in different times and in different places interpreted and experienced and then practiced God's word to them. In Exodus, the passages are written from below. They are written by a people who are oppressed. They are not the winners of history when this was written. They were the ones that were questioning the systems that kept them in place, kept them as slaves. And in Romans, Paul is speaking from a different point of view. He's writing about life from within an imperial state. And Paul has also been persecuted, but he's found a way to follow Christ and be true to his faith and stay alive, at least for the time being. And Matthew has Jesus addressing the church, a church that didn't exist when Jesus was alive, but calling on individuals and the community in that church to hold other believers accountable to what they believe together. Each of these texts locates a life of faith within a specific social context that was applicable to those who were living within that context. And now we have the hard part. See, our own experiences and interpretations of these same texts cannot be separated from how the church has interpreted them in the past. It also cannot be separated from our own lived experiences of the world today. The authors of Exodus did not advocate living by God's word in the same ways that Paul or the author of Matthew did. And the Gospel of Matthew does not lay out the same arguments for action that Paul's letter to the Romans or God's playbook for Passover does. And Paul's zeal, reflecting the premise that an ideal government does have authority from God, and that submission to the government and obedience to what God commands can coincide, were not the realities of the Hebrew people or the realities of Matthew's community as they struggled to find a way to live together after Jesus' death. So what are we to do? How can these various passages just be flung together? And what are we to make of them? I mean, how are we to make meaning and live by the word when the word is flung at us in fragments? Fragments that don't even agree about how we should respond to the word in the first place. These texts seem to contradict each other at basic levels. When should we separate ourselves from the predominant culture, and when should we strive to engage in it? When do we hunker down and protect ourselves and our lifestyles, and when do we confront those who offend us? Are we called to defend ourselves and destroy that which threatens us? Or are we called to survive and simply make peace? Or are we called to listen to those who would like to harm us? These are hard questions. Questions that have no easy answers. And to pretend like they do would be unfaithful. These are questions that the church has struggled with since the beginning of time, which may be our point of entry so that we can finally engage these texts. Luke Timothy Johnson writes that these texts suggest obedience to God cannot take place in isolation from social structures. Faith in the living God demands not only love of neighbor, but also a response to the social order. None of us can escape the reality of a social order. None of us. That means all of us must put forth the effort to discern what it means to live by the word in our world, in our time. And we're not always, or maybe even ever, going to agree on these mundane matters. But my misgivings about preaching these texts and how the church has interpreted them throughout history seem to go with what Jesus says in the gospel reading when he tells us that even what is mundane matters to us and for us, but also far beyond us. See, in the Gospel of Matthew, the word ecclesia that we translate as church appears only twice. And both times that it appears, it has to do with this binding and loosing, something Tom talked about in his last sermon. In both places where the church is mentioned, the wording is just about the same. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. A difficult charge for the church. There's no such thing as a church without conflict. But how we treat each other and those outside the church when things are tense and when we are upset and when we have differences of opinion have consequences that far outlast our own time and place. The choices we make about our faith in response to social structures have the power to bind us to others or loose us from others. They can bind us into even more polarized and separated camps, or they can bind us together in love and trust and commitment to listen even when we disagree. The choices about our faith that we make in light of our social structures can loose people out into the world without them having the benefit of having a Christian community, knowing what Christian fellowship and love and acceptance feels like, and breed instead loneliness and separation and fear and even hate of the church and those who compose it. Or we can loose ourselves from the need to judge others, from feelings of self-righteousness, from fear of having a church conflict, from stereotypes and cultural assumptions, and find a brand new way of living abundantly together. How we place ourselves in God's story and our time and place matters. The things that we choose to participate in and choose not to participate in on the basis of our faith matters. The rules that we choose to follow and the rules that we choose to ignore or fight against on how we think we should respond to the word matter. And it is tempting, it's very tempting for us to want to separate our faith from things that don't seem to be spiritual, things that we label as being highly politicized, or things that we say are only part of our social life, our cultural life, our personal life, our professional life, not spiritual life, only mundane. But the passages in our lectionary this morning seem to say that even the mundane matters. Amen.